Hey, Soraya. Hey Sarah, how are you?
Oh, I'm all right. Tired. Moved
Yeah.
this week. It was a lot of work. It's my first day back, kind of
Uh,
playing catch up.
are,
Um,
are you still on occasional COVID duty?
no, they kind of booted me off, which is nice actually. It's been weird to do air again, and also really really nice to like, oh,
Yeah.
this is my job. I
Right.
can do these things. Um, so anyway, but I feel really out of the loop with TTAC, which I feel kind of bad about because I haven't been able to do anything for a while. Um,
That's
but
okay.
I think it'll be okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
but I wanted to pop in case anything is kind of weird.
No, it's mostly the same. It's just the attendees. You should be able to see when you click on the participants, there's two options, attendees and panelists.
Okay, yeah.
Um, and I've got co-host responsibilities, so I can promote Jennifer when she gets on the meeting, or I think she's here, so I might.
She is here. Yeah, and I read through. Well, I skimmed instructions today.
Otherwise, I think it's just reading that new script at the beginning, and admin can put on the information slide during that, and then roll call and all of that happens the same way. So
Cool. I like the new script because it's short. You only have to do it once.
yeah,
So
right.
thumbs up.
It,
Thumbs up.
it's a much it's a much simplified process, so it's
I like it.
good.
That's good.
And this might be your last meeting as chair, because we'll do one of the updates I have is just a reminder that we do chair and vice chair in January. So
Yeah, yeah. Kind of a quick year in some ways for me for T-Tax because so many other things happening.
right. How are you, Neil?
Doing good. How are you both?
Good.
Good. Yeah.
I didn't realize I was so early.
You're that early. I might adjust the lighting here. It's
I
very
that's
it's
why I
very
was
cold and dark.
well, I keep trying to do that. It's not like my room is like super bright, but like it just the camera blows everything out behind me. So I
Yeah.
was
Well,
just
I just moved and it's very cold because I refuse to use the baseboard heat. Um, and so I have everything is just like big curtains on the windows and it's very dark. I'll get some light at the front. That's a little bit. I don't know how to get those blinds just the way up. New place. That's quirks.
Yeah, I think we all just do as good as we can with the Zoom. Maybe in 5 or 10 years we'll have really good camera technology and we'll all be looking fantastic on our public meetings.
Oh, people are selling things like lights for your Zoom meetings to put on your computer and stuff. Like there's a whole new industry that popped up.
yeah, I tried that with this lamp, but it didn't really work that well.
Neil always looks like he's just glowing in this positive room of light and happiness.
Tiffany, that's what we were just talking about. I was going to mention when you asked me that one day if it was just super bright in here. And it's really not. It's just the camera doesn't do well in light. So
Mine's pretty bright too, but
yeah,
it's pretty
yeah, mine
funny.
always just blows out behind me. So
All right, well, it's 10 o'clock.
I wonder if we should give a few more minutes.
Yeah, I'm gonna give it a couple more minutes in case people are having a hard time finding the link, because it's a little bit different this time.
Yep. Yeah, I think at this point we don't have a quorum, so hopefully we'll get a few more folks. Hey, everyone, just for those of you just getting on, we're gonna give it just a couple of minutes to see if feels like folks are slowly trickling in. So maybe we'll get started here in just a minute.
All right, I'm reading 10:03. Go ahead and get this meeting started. So I'm gonna first off say, thank you for joining our meeting being held via Zoom webinar. When I call for public comment, please use the raise and lower hand feature to let me know you wish to be recognized. Our host will allow you to talk and you'll need to unmute your mic. If you've joined us by phone today, you can raise and lower your hand by pressing *9, mute and unmute using *6. If you are participating by phone, I'll call on you by reading the last 4 digits of your phone number. If you are participating by computer, I'll call the name that was listed when you entered the webinar. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with a roll call. I'm gonna just go ahead and kind of go across the names as I see them. Please tell us who you are and who you're with. My name is Sarah Cofield. I'm with the Missoula City County Health Department. Neil.
Neil Miner, proxy for Donna Gawker with Missoula Parks and Recreation.
Tiffany.
Tiffany Brander, Missoula Parking Commission.
Juniper.
Hi, Juniper Davis, Missoula County Parks, Trails, and Open Lands. And Dory Brownlow from the county is not available today, and she asked me to be her proxy as well.
Corey.
Corey Aldridge, Mountain Line Transit.
Aaron.
I'm not sure which Aaron. I'll go.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I realized Aaron P. Aaron P.
There's multiple of us now. Aaron Payan, the Director of Community Planning, Development, and Innovation, formerly Development Services and Housing and Community Development. So I'll be filling the slot of the Director of that program.
Jeremy.
Morning, Jeremy Keane, City Public Works and Mobility.
Ellen.
Ellen Buchanan, Director of the Missoula Redevelopment Agency, with a foot in Aaron's world. Aaron with an E.
Awesome. Vicky?
I'm Vicky Cernich, and I work for MDT Planning, and I'm sitting proxy for Katie Potts.
Charlie?
Hello, I'm a new employee with the Missoula Area Metropolitan Planning Organization.
Great. Let's see who else we got here. Jacqueline?
Wayne Smith, Montana Department of Transportation, Missoula District.
Chet?
Good morning, everybody. Chet Krauser, Director of Community and Planning Services for Missoula County.
Great. Ryan?
Hi, this is Ryan Hammond. I'm the planner at the Federal Highway Administration.
Great. Let's see who we else got. John?
John Sand, Missoula MPO.
Awesome. And Aaron W?
Yeah, thanks. Aaron Wilson with the MPO.
All right. And then we have our attendees, Elizabeth. I don't know if you can raise your hand or speak.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hi, it's Elizabeth McCauley. I'm with Missoula Valley TMA, proxy for Lynn Hilligard.
Great. And then who do we have from Nelson Nygaard?
Hi, this is Jennifer Wieland with Nelson Nygaard.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jennifer. All right. I think that is our staff and TTAC members and our guests. So let's go ahead and move on to approval of minutes. Can I get a motion for minute approval?
I'll make that motion. This is Neil.
Thank you, Neil. Can I get a second?
I'll second the motion.
Thank you so much. Any discussion on the minutes? Okay, seeing none. I guess I'm not entirely sure if there's any procedure that has changed with this on voting, but I guess you can do all in favor and raise your hand, or just go anybody opposed, raise your hand, because that might be less to look for.
I think the way we've done it is do a general voice vote for all in favor can say aye, and then all opposed can do the same.
Cool. Sounds good. All right. All in favor say aye.
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 All right. Any opposed? Any abstain? All right. Good deal. Let's move on. Okay. So do we have any public comment? All right. Seeing none, let's move on to the first item on new business, which is the review of the long-range transportation plan, scenario analysis, outreach activities, and plans for early 2021 with Aaron and Jennifer from Nelson Nygaard. I did get a chance to look at the memo. Looks great. I look forward to this presentation. Thank you so much.
Yep. Thanks, Sarah. So Jennifer and I will kind of both tag team this presentation, but we're coming back. It's been, oh gosh, I guess it's been a month and a half or a little over a month since we were last presenting, and we've done a lot of work on the scenarios since then. I think the last time when we gave an update, it was sort of what we were thinking of doing for the scenario analysis and sort of the direction we were headed. And so now we're back with sort of all the details, and we're in the middle or beginning of a large public launch of outreach and getting feedback on those scenarios. So this will be a good opportunity, hopefully, for all of you who haven't seen this presentation yet through some other venue, to get an overview of what's out there. We can have some discussion, and then we'll be ready to come back and take some action or make some direction on the preferred plan in the start of the new year. So Jennifer, if you want to start the slideshow. All right, so, and I guess just by way of introduction for those who may not know, Jennifer Wieland is our consultant from Nelson Nygaard, who is leading this project. So thanks for being here, Jennifer. So just taking us back on to a reminder of where we've been and how we're moving forward on the long range plan. Thought it'd be good to just have a quick reminder of our goals that we established back in the summer, I believe. These came out of a lot of public outreach in the spring where we got feedback on the community's values and what people wanted to see come out of the long range plan, and trying to really condense our various goals that we've had in previous plans into fewer but clear goals and objectives that we could use to evaluate all of the decisions that we're making in this plan. So I won't go through these in any great detail because I think we've talked about them a lot, but just as a reminder that this is the goals are the framework in which we're evaluating our plan sort of through each step of the process. So in that evaluation framework that's ultimately going to get us to our preferred and recommended plan, we started with collecting the projects and programs. That was back in the May and June and July of this year. We had information out on our website. We had a call for projects. We did a number of small group meetings with many of you to get ideas for projects that were either not in our current project list or that needed to be updated and reworked for this plan. So out of that, we had a couple hundred ideas of projects and programs. We screened those for suitability for the long range plan, trying to separate out things like programs that may be more appropriate as a recommendation in the plan, but that didn't need to be evaluated as a project as part of the overall funding in our plan. Then we scored those projects using criteria, again, linked back to those 5 goals. And that was sort of a general evaluation of all of these projects to see how well each one would meet those various metrics and goals, which then allowed us to sort of group them into tiers of how effective those projects were. And then now we're at the point where we've developed scenarios and are evaluating those and have done a lot of analysis. And we'll go into a little bit of detail on how we put those scenarios together. But again, using our goals and outcomes and metrics associated with that to help evaluate how well those scenarios will do to achieve those goals. So that's the stage we're at right now. And we sort of thinking about the scenarios, and we've talked about this a little bit, we wanted to both have transportation scenarios of projects and funding, but also think about how growth affects our transportation system. And so we developed 2 growth scenarios that we're using to evaluate what that connection is between our growth patterns and land use and the transportation system. And so really it's we call them scenarios, but they're really a way to test how growth affects each of those other scenarios we have and what effect that growth has on our overall transportation system. And the 2 scenarios that we developed we're calling business as usual, which is growth occurring where we have existing capacity, but we're not assuming it's directed in any specific location or place, and it's really following previous trends and that it might occur kind of throughout the region where there is that capacity. The second scenario we developed is the strategic growth, which we really wanted to look at what would happen if we focused more of the growth in those areas that are highly suitable and have additional capacity and are in locations with existing infrastructure, places with master plans, or able to accommodate much higher density of growth. So really trying to maximize that focus inward approach before moving development out into outlying areas.
You want me to jump in here, Aaron?
Yeah, I'll let you jump in now and talk about the transportation scenarios.
Okay, sounds good. Well, good to see you all again this morning, and thanks so much for making some time to talk about where we are with the scenario planning. So as Aaron mentioned, we're not going to go through these transportation scenarios in great detail today. We shared these with you at the beginning of October, and we made a few changes to each of them to really incorporate your feedback and also what we heard from our Citizens Advisory Committee and our Technical Advisory Committee. But the nuts and bolts of what's included in each is still pretty consistent. So I'll just quickly orient you to each of the scenarios again, and then we'll focus in on what we saw through some of our analysis in terms of how the scenarios perform, and also the ways that the growth approach, as Erin just talked about, impact that performance a little bit differently. So just to orient you to these maps, and these are included in the packet as well, if you've got that PDF up and want to be able to zoom in a little bit more. For members of the public who might be watching, these are also included on our project website, and we have an interactive map that will allow you to explore just a little bit more. So what you'll see across all three of the maps I'm about to show, I'll just orient you to the colors and lines here really quickly, and then talk about each of the scenarios. So all three of the scenarios include a handful of projects that are shown in this dark gray or black color, and those are committed projects. So that's about $110 million worth of projects that are funded and that are moving forward. So these are included in the city's capital improvement program, in the MPO's transportation improvement program, or otherwise have pretty good certainty that they are advancing. So for example, the Build Grant roads are included as one of those committed projects, as well as a handful of others. You'll also see projects that are shown in purple on each of the maps, and those are complete streets and roadway projects. So in a very few cases, there are roadway extensions. A good example of that on the new connections scenario is the extension of Russell Street up to I-90, which would include a new interchange. But the vast majority of these projects are complete streets, and so that means they're including improvements for people driving, for freight, also improvements for people walking and biking in transit. The third color that you'll see are projects shown in green, and those are active transportation projects, so projects that focus on people walking, biking, and rolling. They're a little bit different in each of the scenarios. This scenario, New Connections, includes some of the bigger non-motorized projects like new bridges and new trails. And one example that you can see here is the Riverfront Triangle non-motorized bridge, that connection into downtown. In other scenarios, you'll see more greenways, on-street protected bike facilities, and shared use paths as well. When we move on to other scenarios, you'll start to see projects in orange show up, and those are safety projects, which are primarily intersection projects, but also a few corridors. So I used that as a way to highlight a few of the key projects that are included in New Connections. But what's really important to remember about these three scenarios is that we tried to set them up so that they are bookends, so that they are different enough from one another that they're going to show some differences when we start to do the analysis. So New Connections really focuses on creating new routes. It does include some of our bigger and more expensive projects. I mentioned a couple of them, the Russell Street extension being one of them. But does also limit the number of projects that are included to a total of about $178 million over the next 30 years. That is true of all three of the scenarios, and you'll start to notice the differences when we move on, and you can see that when we have less expensive projects, we see more of them start to show up. So that's New Connections. The second scenario, and again, you see some of the orange start to show up on this one, so a lot of intersection improvements. For enhanced connections, we focused on improving existing systems. And so rather than creating new roads and new trails, we really focused on how do we maintain and improve the networks that exist today. We also really focused on how we make those improvements to support more inward growth and really make some key connections between investments that are already planned. A good example of that are these bike facilities that have been identified for England Boulevard and Union Pacific to Palmer. We were really intentional about trying to think about connections between the investments that the region is making in the Build Grant roads in the Mullen area and to the rest of the region, especially as we start to think about connections into downtown. So this enhanced connection scenario does include a lot more projects than New Connections. It includes some lower cost projects like greenways, on-street protected bike facilities, and a good handful of multimodal and complete streets projects, including the Front Main two-way conversion as one of the projects that we're featuring here. And then the third scenario we call regional equity. And our focus in regional equity was really on some of the projects that scored very well on the equity goals and criteria, and then also projects in the Invest Health neighborhoods. There's a decent amount of overlap between projects in regional equity and enhanced connections, but there are a few key differences where we really tried to focus regional equity on connecting people to affordable transportation options. And so this scenario includes a lot of active transportation projects, in particular neighborhood greenways. It also includes some really important connections between neighborhoods, including the Howard Razor Drive connection to the North Side and North Reserve, and the Highway 200 complete street. So a little bit different in terms of the mix of projects here, and that's important as we start to think about how the projects perform. So there's a lot more to talk about in terms of those scenarios, but we know that you're pretty familiar with them at this point. So wanted to just point folks to one more resource if you'd like to explore these scenarios a little bit more, and that is an interactive map that is linked from the MPO's website. And this gives you the ability to turn on and off each of the scenarios and then to click on an individual project and get a little bit more information about it. So that's an easy way to explore what's included in each beyond just the static maps and project lists that are also available on the website. So before we jump into the analysis results, let me pause there for a quick second. Are there any questions about those three scenarios or the two growth approaches? All of that sounding familiar to folks? Okay, well, let's jump in. Oh, I'm sorry, Sarah or Aaron, are you seeing any hands raised?
I'm looking, I'm not seeing any hands.
No.
Okay, all right, great. Well, then let's talk about how these scenarios perform. So don't worry, we're not going to walk through every single one of these metrics today. We're going to give you some highlights of how the scenarios do advance toward the goals. There are a few key things that I want to highlight here. So as we think about each of the transportation scenarios, we also assessed the ways that the scenarios perform with those two different growth approaches Aaron talked about. And I'll sort of weave that in as we go through some of the findings. For each of the 5 goals, there are a handful of metrics that we looked at. And this little graphic is showing you about 15 of those metrics. I think there are actually even more that we use to evaluate the scenarios. And part of what we really wanted to understand here is, you know, each of these scenarios does good things. It moves Missoula and the region toward the goals that you have set. But each scenario does that in slightly different ways. And so we tried to understand whether each of the scenarios was less or more supportive of the different elements that are included here. So just as a quick example, if you are looking for the little circles that are orange or dark or blue, those are some of the metrics where the scenario performed a little bit better or does a little bit more to advance toward our goals. And so we'll talk about a few of these findings, especially related to safety, accessibility, and connectivity, just to give you a sense of some of the differences, and then we'll come back to a summary. So we'll start with safety. You know, one of the important things when we look ahead to 2050 that we need to recognize and acknowledge is that we can't predict where we're going to, how we might be able to reduce collisions. What we know is that the way that you all design projects in the Missoula region is very focused on safety, and we know that any of the projects that move forward will incorporate best practice safety countermeasures. So that is an assumption that we are making. Part of what we did to understand how the scenarios might improve safety is look at where there has been a history of collisions. And we looked at bike ped involved crashes, and we also looked at all crashes from 2007 to 2018 to really get a sense of how each of the scenarios might have an opportunity to make conditions better. And so for this one, we simply overlaid those crash locations. And the map you're seeing here is the new connection scenario on top of bicycle and pedestrian collisions. And what you can start to see are the number of locations that the scenario has the potential to impact or to improve. And so this simple table just gives a count of the locations where there have been previous bike and ped involved collisions and how many of those locations each scenario has the opportunity to improve. So we see that enhanced connections does touch the most locations that have had past collisions, followed by regional equity and then new connections. I'll note that the enhanced connection scenario includes 14 intersection improvement projects at locations that had multiple collisions between 2007 and 2018. And then also the enhanced connection scenario, which again, we're not seeing here, actually covers the largest number of locations along Reserve Street, which is definitely one of the higher crash corridors in the region. So some good opportunities there, regardless of scenario, but enhanced connections does give us the chance to improve more locations where there have been collisions. So for connectivity, we looked at several different measures to try and assess connectivity. We looked at bike connectivity, we looked at multimodal connectivity, and then there are a handful of other ways that you might think about the ways that a network is improved through one of these scenarios. So the example that I'm sharing on this slide is focused on bike connectivity. And this analysis builds on an approach that you all used in the 2016 Bicycle Facilities Master Plan, where we really try and look at the miles of connected low stress facilities. And so the approach here is trying to identify the level of traffic stress 1 facilities. And so those are going to be the most comfortable facilities, the lowest stress facilities that would feel usable and that would feel good for people of all ages and abilities. And part of what we try and assess here is the connectivity between those lower stress facilities. And that is really important because we know that what often happens is you'll be on one type of bike facility. Let's say you're on a protected bike lane and then you hit an intersection and all of a sudden your trip is disconnected. It's really difficult to get across the intersection and the level of stress really increases. And so this analysis helps us look at that connectivity. So one of the important things that we did was look at just the level of traffic stress 1 facilities, which includes commuter trails and then those very comfortable on-street facilities as well. And then we also added that number of miles to the existing bike network, even the higher stress facilities, recognizing that we want to be thinking about all types of people who use the system. So what you can see in these numbers, the first number is the miles that don't take into account the existing facilities. So the miles of low stress facilities that we would get with each of these new networks. And then we've added the existing facilities to it as well. And so you see that both enhanced connections and regional equity include the most miles of new low stress facilities and really connected low stress facilities as well. New connections is about half of what we see with enhanced connections and regional equity. And again, it's a much more constrained network and also includes more complete streets projects as opposed to some of the active transportation projects. One of the things that's interesting is when we do look at the new connections scenario on different connectivity measures, it does really well when it comes to multimodal connectivity and connectivity for freight. So again, this is an example of how each scenario can really advance the goals in slightly different ways. So next we'll talk a little bit about support for growth. And part of what we wanted to highlight here is, this is really one of the places where thinking about those 2 growth approaches comes into play. And so we looked at, for this particular analysis, we mapped the region's future housing density using the strategic growth scenario. And so again, that's the scenario that Erin described that focuses a little bit more growth inward, that really looks at maximizing some of the capacity that exists in a few key areas. The areas on this map where you see the blue are going to look a little bit skewed, in part because we use transportation analysis zones for the mapping, and so that kind of shifts things in some strange ways. But we're looking at the TAZs that have estimated future density of 5 dwelling units per acre or more. So again, this is really trying to look at, if we were to grow very strategically and hit some of those targets that we've set, how well would these 3 transportation networks serve that growth? One of the things that, even just from looking at the 3 networks on the maps by themselves, you know that enhanced connections and regional equity include more projects. And so because of that, they're also providing better coverage to the region as a whole and doing a slightly better job of serving some of the high density housing areas that we would expect to see. All three of the scenarios do a good job of supporting the Mullen area master plan development. That was something that we tried to be really intentional about as we developed the scenarios as well. So we'll look at a couple other things in a minute where we start to think about how strategic growth can really help to amplify the results we're seeing for the transportation scenarios. But we did really just want to do this overlay and understand whether the networks are supporting different areas of growth. Another key piece when we think about how the region is growing and changing and what has been particularly important to people as we've moved through this project was trying to understand the ways that each of the transportation networks could improve affordability. And this is another measure where we looked at a few different ways to try and assess affordability. We think a little bit about the types of trips that people will have available. So are you able to travel by walking, biking, or taking the bus? Or do you have to drive? But then also we thought specifically about affordable housing sites and locations where there is existing affordable housing. And so this is another example of a pretty simple overlay. We're looking here at the regional equity scenario in purple and black, and then the little green dots are all of the locations as of 2018 where there was existing affordable housing in the region. And so those are housing developments that receive low-income housing tax credits, HUD or Section 8 funding, as well as mobile home courts. And then we assessed how many of those sites are within 200 meters of one of the projects that's included in a scenario. So you can see from the table that the regional equity scenario is within 200 meters of 128 affordable housing locations. And so these are sites, not units. Enhanced Connections also connects to a good number of affordable housing locations, and the New Connections comes in a little bit lower on that front, again, because it's a smaller network. So the last piece of analysis that I will share before we move into some discussion is one of the equity analyses that we did. And for this particular analysis, part of what we wanted to understand was how we might expect to see people's travel behavior, their trip making behavior, change in different areas depending on the network that was selected. And so what we did for this analysis was two different things. First, we calculated the densities of different areas and looked at people with disabilities, youth, so people under the age of 17, older adults, so over the age of 65, people with lower English proficiency, zero-car households, people of color, and median income at or below the federal poverty level. So we created densities of that different combination of demographic and socioeconomic factors. And those are some of the areas that you see highlighted in red on this map. And so some of those areas are the western half of downtown, Franklin to the Fort, Riverfront, Rose Park, Lewis and Clark, and the University District. And then we also did the analysis to incorporate Invest Health neighborhoods. So those three neighborhoods are Franklin to the Fort, North Side, West Side, and River Road. And what we looked at here are the ways that, again, with the strategic growth scenario, people's trip-making behavior would change. And what we saw is that with the enhanced connections and the regional equity scenario, auto trips in these areas would be reduced by more than 5%. And one thing that's important to note about this, it doesn't mean that people are making fewer trips. It simply means that people are able to shift some of their trips away from driving and start to make some of those trips by walking, biking, and transit. And so that's a good thing in terms of the goals that the plan has set. We're looking to provide more options for people, provide more affordable options for people, and really connect people to jobs, services, and schools. And so that is part of what we see as we look at this analysis. We did see that regional equity increases walking trips the most in these areas, and then enhanced connections increases biking trips the most in these areas. So those are a few findings related to some of the equity analysis that we did. And again, this uses the strategic growth scenario where we're putting more people in closer proximity to a lot of the job services and education needs that they may have. So I'll wrap up this discussion of the analysis by looking at maybe a simpler version of that first graphic that we talked about, and just use this as a way to highlight some of what we saw in the growth scenarios as well. So again, the good news is that all three of the transportation networks are advancing the region toward the goals that you've set through this plan. We do see, again, that each of the networks does that slightly differently, and some perform better than others. So we talked a little bit about safety and connectivity, and we really saw enhanced connections start to jump out on a couple of those different measures. When we looked at equity and affordability, those are a couple of the measures where we saw regional equity perform the best. And part of this is inherent in the design of the scenarios. And then as we start to look at vehicle miles traveled, greenhouse gas emissions, and walking, biking, and transit trips, this is where I do really want to highlight the growth scenarios, but then also point out a couple of important things. So all three of the scenarios reduce vehicle miles traveled from the base in 2050. So they're all moving us in the right direction compared to doing nothing, and that's a good thing. The order of magnitude change is not huge, and that is an important thing to note. We also saw that with the strategic growth scenario, so that scenario where we're really focusing growth inward, that growth pattern had a bigger effect on reducing vehicle miles traveled than any of the transportation network scenarios by themselves. So what that shows us is that, as you all know, the connection between land use and transportation is strong, and really that growth pattern is an amplifier to any of these outcomes that we're seeing on the transportation network scenarios. So I think that's a really important piece. And when you think through it, with the strategic growth scenario, we're putting more people in closer proximity to more things. So that provides the ability for increased connectivity and accessibility. It provides the opportunity for people to make trips in different ways and by more affordable modes. And it also reduces the number of miles that people are going to need to travel to get to the places they need to go. So that's just one of the ways that we started to see the strategic growth scenario really act as an amplifier to what we're seeing on the transportation side. The last note I'll make, because somebody asks about it every time, and I know you will as well. So lots of folks have been surprised to see that when we think about greenhouse gas emissions, the new connections scenario performs slightly better than the other two. And part of the reason for that is that there are some projects included in the new connections scenario. The Russell Street extension to I-90 is one that really decrease vehicle congestion in a few key areas. And the analysis that we used for the greenhouse gas emissions is based on vehicle miles traveled, but it also factors in vehicle delay, as well as a mix of vehicle types. And so you do really see some pretty localized reductions in congestion when it comes to new connections, as opposed to a little bit more across the region for the other scenarios. So I just wanted to flag that one before we pause. So with that, I think before we talk about our plans for outreach, I'd love to open it up for questions and feedback and hear a little bit from TTAC about your impression of the scenarios, any preferences or thoughts you might have, or any questions about the analysis.
I'll call on you if you put your hand up so we can have a good discussion here. I also want to thank you, Jennifer, for that really excellent presentation. It's fascinating for me just to watch the enhanced connection scenario just jump out kind of again and again, as addressing so many of the things they're interested in. And I really like the way that you put it together. I think this is a very clear and easy to understand presentation, and also a great way of looking at the projects. Anyway, I'm a fan.
Thank you.
But if there's any discussion from our members, please raise your hand.
Sir, I'm not seeing an option to raise my hand, but I do have a question.
All right, Jeremy. Go for it.
So what happens next? Are we selecting one of these three scenarios, or is there still a process of doing a little bit of mix and match with some of the projects that are included in each one?
Good question. We anticipate that there will be a little bit of mixing and matching as we move forward. So part of what we are asking people to weigh in on over the next month or so, and this is happening at committees, at board meetings, and then in discussions with the public, is some of these exact questions here. We're curious to hear from people how well each of these scenarios meets their travel needs, if they have preferences between them. And then also, what are the types of projects that are really important to people? And so part of the way that we intend to use that information, Jeremy, is if we're seeing a really strong preference for one scenario versus another, we may want to use that as kind of our base for how we shape the recommended, pulling in a few key projects from other scenarios as well. So yeah, we do expect that there will be some mixing and matching as we move from 3 down to our recommended scenario.
So just a comment along those lines, then I think that depending on where you are in town, the different scenarios may apply differently. So, like in the Bill Grant area, obviously we're building new connections with in mind of implementing that master plan and really trying to create new areas where housing can be developed. And so that focus is a little bit different than providing, say, complete streets on existing routes to enhance connectivity. So I just wonder if there's a little bit of nuance in the different areas of town.
I would say the answer to that is yes. And even if we flip back to, I'll just use this map because it's handy and we're looking at the regional equity scenario, you do start to see that the ways the different scenarios connect in different areas are indeed pretty different. So the good news is that, of course, the Bill Grant roads are included in all of the scenarios, but when we think about the connectivity to the Mullen area, when we think about the connectivity to East Missoula or in downtown, the differences are, I don't know if I would say they're extreme, but there are differences between each of the scenarios. And I think that is part of the nuance in why each scenario hits the goals in different ways. Like just as we were talking about connectivity, right? You could say, well, New Connections actually does a lot for connectivity in some key areas of the region. And especially when we think about freight and key commercial corridors. But then on the other hand, regional equity is doing a lot more when it comes to connectivity within a few key areas, when we really focus on the Invest Health areas. So your point is a good one. And I think that's part of the challenge with scenarios is that there's not a bad one, but there's, the way that people see them as stronger or less strong really depends on your individual travel needs and perspective.
All right, thanks, Jeremy. Corey, I see your hand is up.
Yeah. So with the 3 scenarios, I see that there's cost differences. Do we have that? I'd be curious to know what it is like a cost per mile, or see what we get more bang for our buck, in different scenarios.
Actually, Corey, they're all constrained to the same level of cost. They include different projects to hit that number. So each scenario has the $110 million in committed projects. That's consistent. And then each scenario has $178 million worth of other non-committed projects. So the difference is really in how many projects and the types of projects that are included.
All right. Gotcha. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And then just for any of y'all who are curious how to raise your hand, you can open up the panelist side panel by clicking on participants, which is on the bottom of your screen. And then inside that panel, it'll pop up on the side, or you can kind of move to another screen. There's an option to select raise hand in case you're curious about navigating that.
If there are no other questions or comments at this point, we can move on.
Ellen.
Oh, great.
Sorry, I had to unmute. I just want to make a comment. It's amazing to me the level of sophistication that we have achieved, as opposed to how we were doing this when I arrived here in 2004. And I really appreciate that. I mean, the comparison is almost like we sat in a room and threw darts at a wall and argued over whose dart landed where, compared to this really sophisticated analysis. So thank you very much for doing this way.
Thank you, Ellen. I'm glad to hear that it is providing a little bit of rigor to a process. I mean, part of what we set out to do in developing this framework was to try and be really clear with people about how decisions get made so that nobody feels like we're all sitting around in a smoky room and just trading horses to try and get the projects that we want.
Yeah, and I think that's evolved. The nice thing about having an iterative planning process where we have to update this every 4 or 5 years is that we can, if we're being intentional about that and sort of refining our process every update, that we get hopefully get a little bit better every time we do it. So.
I'm not seeing any other hands raised, but I do want to just again echo what Ellen said. I think this is probably one of the best LRTPs that we've had so far. Just the way that the analysis is done and how much you've listened and incorporated some extra concerns we brought this year, things we wanted to address specifically and see how we can achieve them with transportation planning. So thank you.
Thank you for that.
I mean, the darts may have been easier, but the process makes a whole lot more sense and is easier to justify.
A good point.
I think we've been stimulating some good conversation. We presented to planning board Tuesday evening, and I think there was some really good conversation about, and maybe this gets a little bit to what you were asking, Jeremy, in terms of mixing and matching and how we look at different areas and having a conversation about how our transportation investments are supporting or not supporting different areas of growth, and where do we really want to grow, and how do we prioritize those areas through our transportation investments. And so I think it's been a good process to really get people thinking, not just about, well, what transportation projects could we build, but how those investments are really supporting some of our other goals in terms of regional growth or affordability or equity, which is what we wanted to do with a lot of our analysis, is try to make those connections in some way and get people thinking about it. So I think that's starting to happen, and we've already been getting some good feedback on that. So Jennifer,
go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah. So thinking about, we just presented a ton of information, and there's a whole lot more on our website. That there's a lot of analysis, and it's not necessarily complicated, but there is a lot of information to absorb. And so there's still plenty of time. I think this is sort of our first presentation to all of you. We'll have a number of community meetings that we have scheduled, both with groupings of neighborhoods in Missoula and the adjacent community councils in the urban area. And so we'll have a similar kind of presentation conversation about these scenarios and trying to get people to think about how this impacts them in their neighborhood and in their sort of daily lives, and get that feedback. We also have, like I said, a ton of info online, including the interactive map that Jennifer mentioned, that allows you to sort of look at more detail. It's a little bit more user-friendly than a static map if you really want to dive into the details of projects. And then we have a short survey to at least get that initial reaction from people of which scenario are they drawn to, what elements of that are they most excited or interested in. So what types of projects do they like about those scenarios? And then maybe some specific ideas that they want to see carried through regardless of which scenario we go with. So that survey is out there. If anyone on this committee wants to share that, or if there are ideas of other groups that you all are involved in that would be interested in having the conversation, I think that we're committed over the next couple of weeks to do as many of these presentations and engagements as possible, or that we're able to do in a given week. so all of that will be going on through the end of December, and then we'll move into the start of the new year. We'll start taking all that input and start really crafting that final recommended plan, and doing that hard work of, what sorts of tweaks do we need to make, which scenario is preferred, or is it a combination, and then taking that back out to the public to get one more sort of pass through to make sure we've captured people's ideas and are on the right track. So goal of still of having a plan adopted in April, barring any further disruptions to our daily lives that we've all been experiencing this year. Hopefully we'll be on at least maintaining where we're at and can get through all of this. But yeah, excited to see what the community has to say, and then come back to all of you for some actual decision making in the start of the new year.
Awesome, thanks, Aaron. Jeremy, you raised your hand.
Sorry, here we go. Okay, I found the raise hand button. So in the funding scenario, you said $178 million of future funded projects are in each scenario. Does that include both the federal funding and our local CIP projects?
It does, yeah. So that 178 million includes the MPO discretionary federal funds, so our urban funds and CMAC, a small sort of estimate of that, assuming that we'll get some continued TA and transportation alternatives investment. And then we looked at tried to project out what we're spending on capital projects through the CIP, through urban renewal districts. And again, Ellen, I know you love it when we try to spend your urban renewal district dollars, but just using that as a sort of rough estimate that we spent a certain amount on transportation projects over the last few years, and projecting that out over the coming years. And so we were trying to combine, like, what is the full funding we might have available with local and federal dollars.
So Aaron, the mayor has set that bar so high you couldn't possibly attain it.
Well, we'll try.
Give it your best shot. I don't think you got it in you.
Yeah, right. Does that answer your question, Jeremy?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. I think, the reason that's important is I think this plan is setting direction both for the way we spend federal money and for the way we allocate our local money in our CIP. So I think it's really important that we do get those projects in there in the way that we see going forward with our local funding as well.
So if I could just, instead of being a smart aleck, actually respond to what you said. If you look at the percentage of TIF funding that we spend as a city on infrastructure, which is a very, very high percentage of the expenditures, whether it's sidewalks, new streets, improving alleys, bridges, whatever it is, I think it's absolutely legitimate to include that in the long-range transportation plan. We are a major funding source for infrastructure, and I think a lot of the public doesn't understand that.
Yeah, I think it's an important linkage to make, and the challenge is always making sure our plans are in agreement in terms of our prioritization. And so that, Ellen, we've talked a little bit about that, making sure that we're presenting to the MRA board and getting that feedback of where priorities might be, and making sure that we're at least in as close alignment as possible, knowing that this is a 30-year plan and priorities change over time, but keeping that in mind too.
Sure.
I think one note I would make about this schedule as we're looking at it, and Jeremy and Ellen sort of getting to the points you're making about how funds are programmed and what that looks like as we move forward. When we come back to TTAC in January, our focus will be a bit more on the programmatic side, so that we really have time to dive in with you all into the nuts and bolts of that recommended project list. And I think beyond just getting that recommended scenario and the list of projects right is going to be thinking about what we categorize as the near term set of projects. Because as Aaron just mentioned, over a 30-year plan, things are going to change. And what is important for the long range plan is that we've captured the right universe of projects so that as you move ahead, you've got them identified as part of the region's priorities. But then really when we set that nearer term list, that I think is where the alignment between the CIP and the long range plan needs to be the tightest. We want to make sure that we're not moving forward projects that for the city or for the county just wouldn't make sense in the next 5 or 10 years. So that'll be a really important conversation for us to be having in the first part of 2021.
One thing that I just want to kind of clarify with Jeremy too is that our city CIP list includes sidewalk projects, and this plan does not include sidewalk projects. And so all of it includes some complete streets that, projects that include sidewalks, but it's not filling in the neighborhood missing sidewalks, which the city's CIP does do. And so that is a difference in the amount, that ultimately reduces that amount of money that's available if the city continues to put money towards sidewalks.
Yeah, and we've factored that in when we were doing our projections. So looking at what the city has available in terms of gas tax and road district, making sure that we took out maintenance funding and we took out sidewalk program and some of those other ways that we use those funds that aren't for sort of a type of project that would be included in the LRTP. So we tried to factor that in. So when we think of that $178 million, that's not our full available funds. It's just what we think is available outside of those other programmatic elements of our funding. At some point, we probably need a presentation on future funding for the long range plan and just break down all of the different sources we have and how we see them playing out over the next 30 years.
Okay, great. Well, with that, we will wrap it up for today. Thank you all so much for the good comments and questions as always. And thanks so much for your involvement throughout this process. We are excited about where we are right now, but it has meant a lot of attention and energy from you all, both through this group and then also in a lot of other discussions over the course of the year. And we do really appreciate all of that. So happy holidays to all of you. And I will probably not see you again until 2021. So happy New Year as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We don't have any public, so I'm going to go ahead and skirt along right to our next agenda item, which is the overview of upcoming agenda items and potential TTAC discussion topics.
Yeah, and we don't have to spend, since we're coming up on an hour, and we don't need to draw this out too much. I just wanted to have, since we're kind of at the end of the year and we're mid fiscal year, just have a quick check-in on what we have coming up next year and maybe get some feedback if anyone on the committee has thoughts on either presentations or discussions that we want to keep an eye on for, or keep on our list of potential agenda topics. And there's just a few coming up, kind of administrative items that I wanted to put out there before next month. One of which is January is when we have our chair and vice chair changes for TTAC. And so just be thinking about that. With TTAC, we usually have sort of a rotating order of people who take on those roles. So Jeremy is currently the vice chair. And so if we follow that same process, he would roll into the chair position. And then I think based on sort of the history, it would either be Corey or the Urban Transportation District Mountain Line or a county CAPS staff person. We've had a little bit of variability over the last 5 or 6 years, but that one of those two would sort of be the next in line. So we don't have to make any decisions today, but just keep that in mind for January that we'll need to make those decisions. We also have potentially some bylaw changes coming that should be very routine, but as when we were doing roll call, we have Aaron Pehan, who will be sitting on TTAC since Development Services is sort of been absorbed into a new department, or there's been some strategic realignment at the city. And so we want to reflect those changes in our bylaws and get just tidy those up and make sure that we have the right people listed, so we can move forward. And then we'll have some tip amendments coming forward again in January or February. So some of those routine items coming forward at the same time that we're continuing to work on the long range plan. And I suspect that we'll continue to have those monthly updates, since it seems to work well with the virtual environment, having Jennifer able to join us monthly, which is not something I think we would normally have if we were in normal times. We would be much more focused on specific times as far as having her present to the committee. So maybe that's a small benefit of the COVID and having these virtual meetings, is we have access to that regularly. We also have a number of projects that, for better or worse, have kind of landed on the same timeline. So we have Highway 200, that corridor plan will be coming back for adoption, both by this committee and TPCC, but I also want to have all of you thinking about whether, if we bring those plans to like the county commissioners to have them adopt the plans or give their stamp of approval, and same for city council or other committees who might be involved in those projects. We'll have Reserve Street that we haven't had an update on that in a while. It's been kind of a work in progress, and COVID has sort of stretched out the timeline of that project, but we should have a final report hopefully by the end of the year or early January, and then we'll be thinking about what the next step, public involvement step, how to sort of follow up on our I think fairly successful public meeting from January, and do something similar where we bring that report and those results back to the community and these committees. So that will be coming sometime in the new year as well. And then we have some new projects that will get underway. Probably the highest priority of which is going to be the Higgins Corridor study. So that's a partnership between the MPO and the city of Missoula. And we really want to get that project moving and start to think about what that Broadway to Brooks section looks like. So just kind of a highlight of some of the things coming up. I think it's going to be another really busy year, and so we'll try to be efficient with our meeting times. But if there are other topics that this committee wants to throw out there, or questions or interests that you have, I think we can work in those presentations as well. So all that to be said, we'll have a busy year, but looking forward to some good work that I think will come out of everything that we're doing.
Awesome. Thanks. Thank you so much, Aaron. Does anybody have any comment or discussion on this item for Aaron that you can take back?
Well, if folks do have ideas of projects that would be good to present to TTAC or TPCC, or items that we want to take up, definitely just let me know, and we can figure out a way to find a time on the agenda to make that happen.
Awesome. Thanks, Aaron. Let's go ahead and then move on. We don't have any old business. Do we have any announcements or closing comments?
Well, I one announcement that sort of was partially made at the beginning, but we have Charlie, who's joined us as the newest MPO staff member. So hopefully all of you will get a chance to meet him over the next coming months as we work on projects. He started, I guess it's only about 2 weeks ago, a little over 2 weeks ago. So settling in, getting up to speed on the projects we have going on, but we're excited to have Charlie on board.
Awesome. Welcome, Charlie. Any other announcements or comments? All right, seeing none, I'm going to call us adjourned. Thank you all for a great meeting. We'll see you in the new year. And Jeremy is going to get to start doing all the running of the Zoom meetings. All right. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful holiday, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. Welcome, Charlie.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, everybody.